Bueno, we are going to start. You ready? Okay, fantastico. Bienvenido a Fuego. Amo. Okay, we are back together. Let me see what the hell I'm doing. Okay, we are going into our very first keynote of the day. We are going with Alan Taylor. We're talking future of venture capital, innovation, beyond the usual tech hubs. Interesting. Please join me in welcoming Alan again to the stage. He's a managing partner at Endeavor Catalyst. He's got over 20 years of experience. He's leading one of the most active global co-investment funds focused on emerging markets. He's going to share insights on how entrepreneurs in Latin America and beyond are building unicorns. They're transforming their local ecosystems into global powerhouses. So, let's put our hands together. Hold on, let's get him after lunch. I know this is when we get a little tired, so let's go. Let's get Alan on stage. Here we go. Hey, Mamo! There he is. Take it away, my friend.
Thank you, sir.
You're very welcome.
I should always hire you to be my hype man, I guess. That's quite an intro. Good afternoon, everybody. I hope people are doing well. I know we did have lunch, so I'll have the honors here of trying to wake everybody back up and keep you energized after lunch. The talk today is called Investing in Emerging Markets, A View from Silicon Valley. Now, it's called that because I live in Silicon Valley, and I run a venture capital fund that invests everywhere else. So this is the sort of interesting thing I'm going to talk to you guys about today. I've been working on building entrepreneur and venture capital ecosystems now for the last 19 years. I work for an amazing global organization called Endeavor. Maybe quick show of hands, who's heard of Endeavor before? At least one person in the audience used to work at Endeavor, so I know that Endeavor's a little bit known. Endeavor does work now today in 46 different countries all around the world, including most of the major markets in South America and Mexico. I should say, though, we do not yet have an office in Central America. That's one of the reasons I'm here, is to learn and explore and understand, so you understand where I'm coming from. But then mostly what I want to do is tell you a story about what we see happening today in entrepreneurship and venture capital. And the headline of the story is that it is more global than it's ever been. So Endeavor is a global network of trust built of, by, and for entrepreneurs today in 46 different countries around the world. So you can see the map here of where we operate. From the beginning, though, in 1997, we're almost 30 years old, we were focused on emerging markets. The first Endeavor countries were places like Argentina, Chile, and Brazil. And you can see on the map that we focus on Africa, Asia, Europe, the Middle East, essentially looking beyond Silicon Valley, beyond China, beyond India, beyond the markets that capture a lot of the headlines when it comes to entrepreneurship and venture capital, and looking at all these other emerging and underserved markets around the world where we believe we can play a role in helping to build thriving entrepreneurial ecosystems. Today, we have about 600 full-time team members around the world, and I manage a particular part of Endeavor, which is that we run our own venture capital fund, investing in all the best Endeavor companies around the world. So Endeavor today is 27 years old. As I mentioned, one of the very first countries was Argentina. In fact, one of the very first companies that Endeavor ever helped and coached and tried to mentor and support to grow grew up to be a business called, it's a small company, you might have heard of it, it's called Mercado Libre. Oh good, I got some laughs. The joke worked. And we believe very strongly that you can do this from everywhere, including markets like Central America. So maybe just to talk a little bit about the things I believe in most strongly, and I do see people taking pictures. Please take pictures, but I will also share these slides with the group, so you can have them too. I believe in emerging markets. I really do believe that you can do this all over the world. I believe in the compounding of human capital. Now, a lot of us know about compounding in financial capital because we've read Warren Buffett and we understand math and we think compounding is this great thing in financial markets. But compounding is real also in human networks, in human capital. And that's what we see again and again across different regions with what we call this endeavor multiplier effect, that one successful company can actually lead to many more successful businesses and entrepreneurs. I believe very strongly that talent is globally distributed, right? So there are incredible people everywhere. And what used to be true maybe 20 or 30 years ago is that typically those incredible people from different places, ultimately they always had to move somewhere else, right? They would move to New York City, they would move to Silicon Valley, they would move to Dubai. Today, I think you can still move to those places, but what's more true today than ever before is that if you're interested in entrepreneurship and building a scalable big company, you can do it from everywhere, and so you can stay home and do it where you're from. The last thing I believe in very strongly is that venture capital and what I'll call meritocratic, merit-based wealth creation are actually the greatest tools for economic development, and that's why I do this work at Endeavor. That's why I got into it 20 years ago. That's why I do it today. I actually believe entrepreneurs can change the world, and as venture capitalists and investors, we can help, right? But the stars of the movie are very much the entrepreneurs. Raise your hand if when I talk about venture capital, you feel like it's something you know about. Either you've raised venture capital, you are a venture capitalist, or you're connected to it in some way. Okay. For those of you who are not, or actually for those of you who are, I think one of the best ways to understand venture capital is that to succeed in venture capital, you only have to do two things. First, you have to be contrarian. You have to fundamentally believe something that other people don't believe. This guy's nodding in the second row. He knows what I'm talking about. And then you have to be right. And you have to do it in that order. It's required. So the entire idea around entrepreneurship and venture is you do have to think differently. You have to try something that other people today didn't believe in and invest in that and build for that and frankly do it for a very long time sometimes to ultimately have success. Now the very contrarian thing that I believe deeply, as I said before, is in emerging markets. And the reason why is that today emerging markets represent about 60% of the people in the world, right, of the global population, about 40% of the GDP, and only 8% of global private capital. And so you don't have to be an economics major or like a genius to see that this is an opportunity, right? That this is essentially an underserved, underfunded thing that I think is being addressed already today, but we're going to see much more of in the next 10 to 15 years. So the main story is about venture capital going global, and it's a story that has three parts, right? So if we start over here in part one is all about more venture capital dollars starting to be invested in more markets around the world. And this actually did start about 15 years ago. So when I got started in Endeavor, and again, I'm from California, I grew up near Silicon Valley, 20 years ago, almost all the venture capital in the world was in the US. But about 2010, for the first time, you start to see more venture dollars being invested outside of Silicon Valley. Part two of the story is about building billion-dollar companies or unicorns in these other markets. And I'm going to show you guys today how that's also becoming increasingly global. And part three of the story is about exits, IPOs, acquisitions, and making money to sort of show that this whole cycle works for venture capitalists. So that's the three parts of the story, and it covers in total, going from 15 years ago to 10 to 15 years into the future, right? So this is a 3-decade-long story that we're talking about, and I'm going to posit, I'm going to argue today that we're somewhere kind of right in the middle of this story right now. All right, we got 20 minutes. You guys ready for the story? Okay, here we go. At least a couple people were awake. I heard a couple answers there. Okay, seguimos. So part one of the story is about venture capital becoming a global industry. And here's the data, right? As I mentioned, you go back 20 years ago, 90% of all the VC dollars were invested in the US. Now, about 2015, you can see the picture is roughly 70% of venture capital dollars were invested in the United States. Fast forward to today, it's about 40% in the United States, meaning the majority of venture capital being invested today, right now, in 2025, is actually being invested outside of the US. Now, it doesn't feel like that, because if you read the headlines about entrepreneurship, it's still all about OpenAI and Anthropic and Silicon Valley and companies in the US. But the reality is that over the last 15 years, driven largely by China, India, Western Europe, markets like Germany and the UK, and a very robust ecosystem in Israel, you're already driving more and more capital outside of the US. Now, what's interesting is you can then look at these are the top 6 venture markets in the world, right? United States is still the #1 market, China's #2, India, Germany, UK, Israel. But Endeavor doesn't really invest in any of these places. In fact, 91% of our investments are outside of those top 6 established VC markets. We invest in Latin America, in other parts of Europe, that's Eastern Europe and Southern Europe, in the Middle East, in Southeast Asia, and in Africa. Another way to think about it is that our fund, Endeavor Catalyst, looks elsewhere, or perhaps a way I like to think about it is we are investing in the future of where the world is really going. So our fund over the last 12 years has invested several $100 million in these places. Right? These are our top 10 markets globally. Brazil's our #1 market. Mexico's #2. #3 is Indonesia. #4 is Egypt. #5 is the UAE. #10 is Saudi Arabia. And if you're looking at this thinking, man, this guy must take a lot of airplane flights, yes, that is true. I've flown about 3 million miles in the last 15 years to do this crazy job. But what I'll tell you is that as venture goes global, Latin America, the Middle East, and Africa remain underpenetrated by venture. So you can see here actually where parts of Europe, China, India, even Southeast Asia have essentially caught up a bit to the United States in terms of on a per capita basis and a per GDP basis, the amount of venture being invested there. But when you measure it against GDP and you look at market potential, these 3 regions I highlighted in blue, Latin America, the Middle East, and Africa, are still way underpenetrated in terms of market potential. And this isn't just about backing or investing in kind of copycats of businesses from other places, right? People say, oh yeah, I understand. Latin America, that's like, they copy things from the US. That's not actually how it works, right? If you look at this chart from Andreessen Horowitz they put out earlier this year, these are the top 50 Gen AI mobile apps in the world, according to MAUs, monthly active users. And our Endeavor team, went through and highlighted in purple all the ones that are actually being built in emerging markets. Right? They're being built in Brazil and in Turkey. In fact, one company in Turkey builds 3 of these of the top 50 AI apps in the world. But that's not part of the narrative that we're reading about, everything is happening in Silicon Valley. So part 1 of the story is about more venture capital going into more of these markets because there's more innovation and more company building happening everywhere. Part 2 is that unicorns, this idea of a billion-dollar private company, are no longer so rare, and they're increasingly global. So I am going to talk for just about 2 minutes about unicorns. So I see, I have a 6-year-old daughter, so if you guys are excited, I'm going to talk about unicorns right now. She always likes it when I talk about unicorns. So actually, do people know the tech definition of a unicorn? Okay, so this comes from an article written back in 2012, 2013, about this idea of building a billion-dollar startup. And back then, this was actually really, really rare. Right? So there were only 39 unicorns in the world, if you go back to 2013, and 100% of them were in the US. Right? This was Facebook, this was Uber, Zynga for games, LinkedIn. Now, fast forward to today, there are now more than 1,400 unicorns in the world, and only half of them are in the US. Right? 20% are in China, 5% are in India, and then we pay a lot of attention to the head of the unicorn here and the horn. Right? These are Endeavor's markets. Right? This is elsewhere. This is Latin America, Europe, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and Africa. And we believe there are going to be more and more big, important companies built, more Mercado Libres, more new banks, more things like this built outside the United States over the next 10 or 15 years. But building a unicorn is not easy. I sit on the board of an organization called the Kauffman Fellows, and we actually looked at 250,000 startups, 250,000 businesses started over the last decade that had at least made it to raising kind of seed stage VC funding. So this is not all the companies started. This is all companies started that raised some venture capital. And it turns out from that data set, if you raise a seed stage round, the odds of building a billion-dollar company in the data are 1 in 140, right? So that's a 0.7% chance. Now, don't tell the entrepreneurs in the room, because they want to believe that they're going to be the unicorn. The idea is, as an entrepreneur, you have to believe that you're going to be that one. That's part of what being an entrepreneur is. But the actual odds of doing this are very, very, very hard to do. What happens in venture capital, though, is that some investors do tend to get access. Venture capital, we were talking about in the workshop this morning, is an access class more than an asset class. They get access to invest in a lot of the best companies. And so this professor from Stanford has done a study of who are the top unicorn investors, right? And a unicorn investor here is a venture capital fund or an angel investor who invested in a company that later grew up to be a billion-dollar business. And his team has actually looked at all 1,400 unicorns. They studied more than 11,000 investors, and they came up with a list of, okay, these are the best investors in unicorns. Do you guys want to see the list? Okay, good, because I brought it. The number one investor in unicorn companies in the world is Sequoia Capital. Right? Number 2 is Andreessen Horowitz. Number 4 is Kleiner Perkins. Number 6 is Y Combinator. These are brands you likely know, because these are the most famous, sort of known Silicon Valley brands. And this very esteemed professor from Stanford is publishing all over Twitter and LinkedIn and everywhere, what's happening with the best unicorn investors. But as Endeavor, and with our fund, Endeavor Catalyst, we've actually backed a lot of unicorns. And so we looked at this data and we thought, well, this is kind of weird. It's missing Rappi, okay, and it's missing Kavak, and it's missing, why is it missing all these companies that aren't in this guy's data set for his unicorn study? And it turns out they only included data from the United States. So they just left out half the world, right? Remember, only 50% of the unicorns are in the US today. So they left out China, they left out India, they left out everywhere else. I actually called this guy, this gentleman here, the Stanford professor, and I said, hey, what's the deal? Why'd you leave out the rest of the world? He said, oh, the data's too messy, we can't figure it out. Plus, it doesn't really matter. Well, that's almost like a call to action for us at Endeavor, or for maybe us in this room, to prove this guy wrong, right? To say, hey, this actually matters a lot. Because remember, here's our fund again, right? We're investing all over the place. Our biggest markets in the world are in Latin America. And so far, one company in every 6 that we've backed with Endeavor's fund has grown up to be a unicorn, right? So that's in 24 different countries. In 11 countries, we've actually backed the first unicorn, right? Kavak was the first unicorn in Mexico. Qatar was the first unicorn in Malaysia. We've been doing this all over the world. And so I had my own in-house data team rerun this study. And I said, hey, if the Stanford professor won't do it, let's try to do it ourselves. Just take his methodology, give it to some AI, let it run the data on the rest of the world, and tell me who the best unicorn investors are if you actually look not at the US or at China or India, but at this 25% in the kind of head of the unicorn here. And it turns out if you do that, our fund, Endeavor Catalyst, is the #1 investor in unicorns in markets elsewhere. And so I think we've earned the right to kind of stand up and say, hey, it's time to pay attention to elsewhere, right? We need to really take seriously this idea you can build a billion-dollar company from Argentina, from Malaysia, from Guatemala. You can do this from anywhere. And that's what the last part of the story is about, right? Because part 3 is about exits. Because you'll encounter a lot of smart people who say, okay, cool, I believe you, there's good entrepreneurs in Latin America. I think this is an interesting idea. I made a couple angel investments, or my friend has a venture capital fund, but show me the exits. Like, where are the exits? And the reality is that this takes a long time. Most of the time we read a headline about a company selling for $1 billion or doing an IPO, that company is 10 to 15 years in the making. Right? Jeff Bezos said, anything that's hard to do will take you at least 10 years. And Bill Gates actually is the one who said this great quote that most human beings tend to overestimate what we can do in 1 year, but we underestimate what we can do in 10. And I have found that to be very true in entrepreneurship, is that the ones who can kind of play the long-term game and be resilient and play for 10 years can do incredible things. And so if you take that lens, and you guys, I don't know if you can see the numbers down here at the bottom, but venture investing sort of started back in 2010 outside the United States. 5 years later, you start to get some unicorns. 5 years after that, by 2020, now we're starting to get some exits, right? But it does take a long time. And so exits have followed capital, becoming more and more global, right? This is Alibaba from China, which was a big IPO in 2014. Spotify is originally from Sweden. The first company we ever invested in with Endeavor is Globant from Argentina, which also did an IPO about a decade ago. But these successful global exits tend to fall into 2 categories. And if you're a startup founder or if you're a startup investor, you should know which one of these you're focused on, right? Because this is about regional winners, the most successful business in a region, right? That's Mercado Libre. It's also about the concept that global innovation comes from anywhere, right? And that's Spotify coming out of Sweden, right? Or Skype originally being built in Estonia. You can build global businesses from anywhere. So on the regional winners point, China was first, right? You had Tencent, you had Baidu, you had Alibaba, you had these big businesses built in China. What's interesting from a venture perspective is there now have been a number of regional winners from elsewhere. So not just Mercado Libre in Latin America or Nubank, but you have C Group from Indonesia, you have Grab in Singapore, you have a business called Talabat in Kuwait and the UAE. Heck, you have a company called Kaspi. Actually, this is a fun test. Anybody ever heard of Kaspi? I got a couple. Okay, smart public market investors, I guess. Kaspi is a $17 billion market cap company from Kazakhstan, listed on the New York Stock Exchange. And when I tell that to people, they look at me like I have 3 heads, right? Like, what do you mean it's from Kazakhstan, right? You can build really big companies from all over the place, and this idea of global innovation comes from anywhere means you can also do it from smaller markets and smaller places. Right, I mentioned Skype coming from Estonia, UiPath, which is a wonderful business, now listed on the New York Stock Exchange, originally built in Romania. We talked about Spotify. People saw the acquisition of Wiz this year for more than $30 billion, built in Israel. So the best way to try to look at this data is to look at the best venture capitalists in the world and to see where they're from. Right? And the Forbes Midas list, which is sort of like the all-star team of venture capital, every year publishes the top 100 VCs in the world. And for a long time, all of those were venture capitalists based where I live in California. But this past year, there were 27 different VCs on that list based outside the United States. 16 were in China, right? 1 was in Dubai, 6 were in the United Kingdom. Nicolas Sakazi from Kazakh Ventures from Argentina, living in Uruguay, was the representative from Latin America. And what's maybe even more notable is of the important companies that the Midas list listed, 1/3 of them were non-US companies, right? They were businesses like Canva from Australia, Flipkart from India, and Nubank in Brazil. So in my last 5 minutes, what does this all actually mean? I think there are 3 things to keep in mind if you're a founder, an investor, or an ecosystem player. They are that there is going to be, over the next 10 or 15 years, this concept of geographic alpha. Right? This is actually a term made up by a friend of mine, Alex Lazaro, who runs a great emerging market fund called Fluent Ventures. But this is the idea that outside the United States, and even outside those top 6 markets, right, beyond China, India, Western Europe, Israel, there are going to be very real investment opportunities in startups. And just like in the United States, the power law in venture capital is global, meaning the winners will be bigger and more global than in previous eras. But, especially if you want to be on the investing side here, you have to know that this takes time. Venture capital is an illiquid asset class where it can take 10 to 12 to 15 years for that first generation to succeed in a given geography. It's a long-term game. You should invest in venture. You should do it with money you don't need next year or the year after. I happen to personally believe that the illiquidity of venture capital is more of a feature than a bug, because it actually means that you keep your money in for the long term to allow for that long-term thinking and that compounding. But it's a really, really important concept to think about. Okay, last couple of things I want to leave you guys with. One is a picture. Does anybody know who this is? And yes, I am kind of old, so it's a black and white picture. Okay, so this is Roger Bannister. This photograph is taken in 1954. He was the first human being to do what? Run a mile in less than 4 minutes. In 1954, Roger Bannister ran a mile in 3 minutes, 59.4 seconds. What does that have to do with entrepreneurship or anything that I'm talking about? The main reason I talk about this example is because before Roger Bannister did this, everybody was 100% convinced this was impossible. Could not be done. Will never be done. Human beings cannot do this. No one will ever run a 4-minute mile. And then he did it. And that in and of itself is a pretty amazing story. But if you want to get a sense for what Endeavor believes in, the next slide is even more important. Because Roger Bannister's world record of 3 minutes and 59 seconds, 59.4 seconds, his record only lasted for 46 days. And then somebody else did it. And then a third person did it. And now, today, more than 2,000 human beings have done this. And this is what we need to do with entrepreneurship and venture capital in places like Latin America and Central America and Guatemala. We need a few amazing success stories to go first, and they'll create jobs, and they'll create revenue, and they'll do amazing things. But they also show that this is possible, right? Because if you're a founder today and you're building a startup, my hunch is most of the people you told about your startup, your parents, your uncle, your boss, your neighbor, and you pitched the whole thing, and at the end they said, sí, eso no posible, eso no va a pasar. You can't do that. That doesn't work. That's impossible. Let me tell you the reasons why it won't work. But the reality is, it just takes a few people to go first, to be Roger Bannister, to show what is possible. And today, Endeavor is supporting entrepreneurs all over the world. These are all CEOs and founders of Endeavor companies building businesses in Istanbul, Turkey, in Lagos, Nigeria, in Bogota, Colombia, really everywhere. And to be candid and open and honest with you guys, these people are not, white guys in blue shirts and khaki pants living in Silicon Valley and Palo Alto, right? These are founders building big companies everywhere. This slide is pictures of venture capitalists. that I have backed, that I believe in, that I think are building the future in other places, right? So this is making venture capital actually look like society as a whole. Venture capital is going global. It started 15 years ago. It's happening right now. And over the next 15 years, it's going to create amazing outcomes for LPs, for limited partners, for GPs, for people who start funds, and for the entrepreneurs they back. And so, I want to end with a quote. This is from a friend of mine named Matt Kohler, who works at a fund in Silicon Valley called Benchmark. But Matt says that the job of a venture capitalist is actually not to predict the future. It's not to see the future. It's just to see the present very clearly. Now that sounds pretty simple, but it turns out that really clearly seeing what's happening with new technologies, with AI, with the globalization of talent, it's hard to do. It's hard to really clearly see what's going on right now today, especially when there's a legacy, and I'll admit a little bit of a bias, I think, in how we get a lot of information. So the bias for the venture industry, for the entrepreneurship industry, is still US-centric. Right? We're still telling these stories that everything is about Silicon Valley. Trust me, I live there. Silicon Valley is an amazing place. You should come and visit. Some of you guys should move there, but you don't have to move there, because you can build a really big company everywhere else in the world today. And that's my main message I want to leave you with. I did get the magic red flashing timer, so I'll end with this message, and I'll be here today if people want to talk more about this. But I really do believe, and Endeavor believes very deeply, that talent is everywhere. Right? These are all Endeavor entrepreneurs from different parts of the world who've built very, very big multi-billion-dollar companies. Talent is everywhere. Success can come from anywhere, and the future is elsewhere. Thank you very much.